Now, the interesting part of Latin America is that if you take it as a whole, it has perhaps the cleanest energy sector in the planet, and it also has an energy surplus. And what makes it so clean is that you have so much water. That means a lot of hydro coming from Brazil and the countries that are around the Amazon and also in Central America. That makes for strong energy security in many of these countries. And given that you have increasing oil availability, the energy surplus in hydrocarbons is also increasing. So the region has a lot to offer to itself and to other regions, provided policy is enabling.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter markets are here.
Welcome to a special episode of Smarter Markets, recorded at CERAWeek 2026, where the theme is Convergence and Competition, Energy, Technology, and Geopolitics. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Aldo Flores-Quiroga, non-resident fellow for Latin America's Energy Studies at the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. We'll be discussing the role of convergence and competition in the North American energy industry, as well as global geopolitics following the U.S. military actions in Venezuela and Iran. Hello, Aldo. Welcome, Smarter Markets.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, it's really great to have you here. Thank you for joining us in the podcast studio in the Nexus Ballroom at S&P Global CERAWeek. The theme this year at CERAWeek is Convergence and Competition, Energy, Technology, and Geopolitics. Your career makes you a wonderful guest to discuss these themes with us. You were Mexico's Deputy Secretary for Hydrocarbons, a member of the Board of Directors of Pemex and Senegas, and you were the Secretary General of the International Energy Forum. And the convergence and competition is a useful framing for discussing the North American oil and gas industry today. Over the past 2 decades, of course, the shale revolution has made the United States the world's largest oil and gas producer and the leading exporter of LNG. And so I wanted to start today by asking you, how has this affected the evolution of the relationship of the oil and gas industry between the United States and Mexico? And is that relationship a story of convergence or competition?
Well, let me start with the last part. I think it probably it's neither. It's more than convergence or competition, is complementation. That has been the pattern for a long time, but the nature has changed significantly over the last 10 years. So it used to be that Mexico was a net energy exporter, and Mexico is now a net energy importer, and that means mainly imports from the U.S. While as Mexico's oil and gas production has been declining, just about the same time, U.S. oil production and gas started increasing. So starting in around 2015, Mexico became a net importer of U.S. products, with a pattern in which Mexico's dependence has increased substantially. The figures are, I think, very telling. Mexico imports close to between 80 and 90% of its natural gas use comes from Texas, basically. It's a level of dependence that you would probably find in a few European countries that are importing from Russia natural gas. And Mexico imports about half of its fuels products from refined products from the U.S. as well. So it's complementation, not convergence in the sense that both countries are doing something similar. And more than competition, there's a lot of collaboration between both countries in the energy industry.
And could you describe the nature of some of that collaboration? Is it political or more at the industry level, or both?
It's both. It goes through ups and downs, but overall, the energy sector has been very collaborative. Mexico does have some historic misgivings about allowing more commercial or investment participation in Mexico by foreign firms. But nonetheless, it's a very productive relationship. Mexico owns a refinery in the US, for example, and American companies own assets also in Mexico in various areas. This is a structural relationship. It has been deepening for many decades, and I think it will continue to do so. I also see that policymakers on both sides recognize the importance of that relationship. Certainly for Mexico right now, its energy security, its only significant option to solve its daily energy security needs is the United States.
If I understand correctly, I believe you were deeply involved in opening up Mexico's oil industry to foreign investment. What was the historical reluctance and what was the challenge you were able to overcome?
The historical reluctance comes from a decision Mexico made in the 1930s to nationalize the oil industry. There's a lot of baggage behind that decision. It was very much driven by dissatisfaction in Mexico and a conflict between Mexico's government and foreign companies with respect to respecting Mexican laws and labor laws. So this led to this very strong feelings of nationalism and control of the industry. So it took many decades, 8 decades, for us to get to a point to attempt this opening. And now we can say that this opening has became more partial and that there was a reversal. And with respect to the policies that we believed in, we did believe, and by we, I mean we were a group of policymakers that believed in the power of competition and the creativity it unleashes. But many in Mexico don't have that perspective. And for now, that perspective is still in place. And we ended up with hybrid system where we have some competition and we have the more statist regime that we had before. So it's still some progress in my view, even if we would have liked to see much more down the road.
There's a little more financial integration, I guess. And then there's also, I was curious, how much do you see the energy systems in the US and Mexico and maybe North America more broadly as integrated? You mentioned Mexico gets 80-90% of its gas from the United States. Mexico also exports a large amount of crude oil to be refined in the United States and then sent back to Mexico as refined products. How much do you think it's working as kind of a more integrated system than maybe it did a few decades ago?
Well, more and more, also the interconnections, if you count pipelines and electrical transmission lines have grown. The level of exchange, the level of financial integration, as you mentioned, and the support has been growing. I don't think that this is a trend that will stop. Even less so now that we're in a world that is thinking again about regions, and it would be wise to think about North America truly as a more integrated region for security reasons, for competitive reasons, for development reasons, for all sorts of reasons that are beneficial to the three countries.
It wasn't too long ago that from the US perspective, Mexico was kind of the major export market for natural gas. And now, of course, there's LNG. How has the rise of LNG affected Mexico in terms of being an importer now that there are so many more outlets for US gas?
The key question in Mexico is whether the level of growth of LNG exports from the US, to what extent will it impact pricing of the natural gas in Mexico? And then the impact has not been that big, partly because some of the gas that is being sent to Mexico does not necessarily have another outlet, right? So I think that natural gas in West Texas would be even cheaper or more negatively priced were it not for Mexico's constant demand. That said, it's still an open question with all these developments and the importance of LNG for the security equation in other parts of the world. Who knows? Maybe it grows to such a degree that the price level of natural gas in Texas increases, and that will affect, obviously, Mexico as well, right?
Do you see the North American energy system becoming more integrated going forward? And do you think that would be a good thing or a bad thing? And what do you think would need to happen to allow further integration?
I think it's going to integrate further. I certainly hope that is the case. I think energy integration means more energy security, more options. The drive in Europe, for example, has been to integrate energy markets further. It's a slow process, the European bureaucratic process. The North American process has its own particularities that makes it kind of slow, but I think it's to the benefit of all countries, and we're already seeing it. Again, it's those pipelines integrating Texas and Mexico that have been supporting the growth of both economies and certainly the growth of the Mexican manufacturing success. It is Canadian pipelines that are supporting energy security in the US. And there's all sorts of infrastructure that has been built that is helping the three countries.
North America is a bit unique in the world as it's very oil and gas rich compared to many other places. But I was curious, as we think about the move towards more renewables in recent years, what role do you see renewables playing in Mexico?
Mexico has a strong potential for renewables, sunny country, and also with some very windy areas. There has been an effort that to increase the participation of renewable energies. It has been at a slow pace, and that's because of policy that has been very volatile. And that is a challenge in general for renewable energies anywhere. Let me focus a little bit on the US. If you think of the oil and gas policy of the last 3 or 4 US presidential administrations, is not consistent. And that means that signals for renewables projects are not consistent. I mean, you would say that maybe in some states in the American Union are providing some consistency, but overall, if you think of federal policy, it's not exactly in the same place. So Mexico has been similarly affected. The current president of Mexico is very much someone that likes renewables. We should be seeing more activity there, but policy is still getting in the way.
And I know you're a fellow at Rice University for the broader Latin America energy studies. How do you see the rest of Latin America situated into this kind of increasing integration in North America?
It also has been a very slow process of energy integration in the region. One reason has to do with geography. The region is huge. I mean, it takes just as long to fly from Mexico City to Santiago as it is from Mexico City to London. And it's not only huge, but the mountains, the geography makes for more expensive investments. You also need a critical mass for demand. And that has slowed down the process yet. Or then again, we're seeing more transmission line interconnections that will allow for a more integrated electricity market, at least from Mexico to the north of South America, to the Andean countries. And we see some substantial trade still in all products. Now, the interesting part of Latin America is that if you take it as a whole, it has perhaps the cleanest energy sector in the planet, and it also has an energy surplus. And what makes it so clean is that you have so much water. That means a lot of hydro coming from Brazil and the countries that are around the Amazon and also in Central America. That makes for strong energy security in many of these countries. And given that you have increasing oil availability, the energy surplus in hydrocarbons is also increasing. And Latin America is therefore contributing so much to the growth of supply in the planet for oil and gas. You think focus on Argentina, on Brazil, or Guyana, if you count it as part of Latin America, Venezuela, that should be coming at some point. Mexico, if its policy changes, should be doing more. So the region has a lot to offer to itself and to other regions, provided policy is enabling.
So it sounds like Latin America has been a bit in the forefront with so much hydroelectric of having clean power. And How much will that be able to drive increasing build out of the electrical grid, as you said, across countries to spread that hydropower? Or is the water and the dams themselves spread out enough?
It took a while to integrate the Central American electricity grid. That integration allows, in principle, for trade from Mexico to, say, Ecuador, because you have also an integrated Andean system. But that's still going to take a while. But if then you go to Brazil, that is the champion. I mean, half of the clean power generation of the region is at least Brazil. It's so much about water and share resources, and the important dams that Brazil has with Argentina and Paraguay and the like allows for significant trade. Actually, Paraguay is serving its own electricity needs only with hydro. So it's a very strong security equation for them.
Well, now I feel like I also need to turn a bit to geopolitics. Of course, Venezuela this year, the United States military captured President Maduro. The United States is also involved in a military conflict in Iran at the time. Maybe we could start with Venezuela. What do you make of that incident? Does it signal a change in the relationship between the United States and Latin America? Or has it changed how people in Latin America are viewing the United States right now?
What has been difficult pattern of the relationship between the US and Latin America, intervention has been a common part of this relationship. The US has intervened either directly or indirectly in the political process of the region. If you think of the 19th century, we had a good share of gunboat diplomacy then going at the beginning of the 20th century. And then during the Cold War, of course, opposition to the Soviet Union's influence in the region was very, very intense. So Latin America has, let's say, some misgivings about the ongoing presence of the US in the region. And Venezuela is yet another example of that. Then again, the Venezuela situation was quite particular. You have a population that were not living by any means under a successful economic regime, and any change would have been welcome. What I think about Venezuela is that the changes that are coming, they must have domestic buy-in. The people have to feel that they are theirs. Otherwise, whatever new investment regime for the oil industry is developed will not survive for the long term. And that is a challenge right now for the oil industry in Venezuela, definitely. Now that we see the institutions, the regulations, the signals that this new reality is here for the long term.
I'm old enough to remember back when PDVSA was one of the large professional state oil companies, really well respected.
Yes, stellar company, yes.
And of course, that ended. What do you see? I know it's very early, but what do you see as the potential future for the oil and gas industry in Venezuela?
There's a lot of work to be done for the future to be bright. Many investments have to be made, not only to revamp, recuperate infrastructure that has been run down, also to clean up environmental disasters that have been going on. That doesn't mean that it is not possible to get there. It just means that there's a lot of work ahead and a lot of policy and institutional consistency required.
Any lessons that could be learned from Pemex in rebuilding an oil company in Venezuela?
I would emphasize what I just said: policy consistency, clear rules, provide certainty to investors that whatever they are risking, they can have a reasonable expectation of recuperating it. With such a regime, then I think that future for Venezuela will be very bright.
And now, of course, the United States is also involved in a conflict in Iran, having big impacts on the oil market. Do you see those two military operations related, or do you see them as distinct?
Well, if you read the media, the suggestion is that they are related. I, of course, can say, kind of affirm that indeed it was the success in Venezuela, that it was a simpler operation, did inspire what would have happened, what is happening in Iran or the operation in Iran. The connection that I see in any event is that both administrations estimated or saw these two countries as threats from the terrorism angle. If you classify drugs and migration as terrorism, then you would have not only Venezuela, but many countries involved or classified that way. I think it's a stretch. But anyway, that's where it seems that they were connected. Otherwise, it's a different geopolitical equation that is happening in either area, partly because the U.S. is the uncontested power in the Americas.
And when you look now, for oil analysts, the threat of a closure of the Straits of Hormuz was always the big thing that could happen. And now that's been happening, affecting not only oil, but you've had Qatari LNG taken offline and some of the production facilities damaged. That's about 20% of the global LNG production. How do you see what's happening now in the Middle East kind of shaping energy markets as we move forward?
The closest analogy we have for this event is the 1970s. It is an analogy that works not only in terms of where the disruption came from. The oil embargo was initiated by Arab countries in the Middle East, and it affected a little bit less, but about the same percentage of global supply at that moment. So they are similar. The difference lies right now in the fact that we've seen right now a 50 to 60% price increase. At that time, it was like a fourfold price increase. So it was at that moment seen as more dramatic. What we have now, and this is a key aspect, is that the response to the oil shocks of the 70s involved investments in trading alternatives. So it was the strategic reserves, the creation of the IEA, the diversification of the energy mix. So France went nuclear big time, Japan as well. The UK went more decisively to the North Sea. Most countries implemented energy efficiency measures. The US, with its limits of like the 55-mile-per-hour limits on speed. The US going for more coal. We saw those adjustments. The combination of those adjustments have made the current crisis less severe. But to go back to where I was saying at the beginning, the analogy works because we're going to see now more investments to make the world less dependent on that choke point that is the Strait of Hormuz. We can see more pipelines to go around or overcome that strait. And we'll see more investments in other energy sources and in other regions. So I wouldn't be surprised. Speaking of complementarities between Mexico and the US, if provided the policy environment is fine, if we can see more exports of US products through Mexico to Asia, that would be an outlet, for example, for Texan gas and oil that is regionally trapped, but that could be very easily shipped to the Mexican Pacific, for example.
So that would be pipe it through Mexico.
Exactly. So there's many projects that are being mentioned, but this type of event can make them a reality.
And thinking of the current event, I think a lot of focus has been on how long does it go on? And we've seen prices for physical crude oils, $150, even if the benchmarks like Brent have stayed closer to 100. How long do you think this needs to go on before we have a real problem? You mentioned in the 70s when you had a 3-4-fold increase in price. How much time do you think we have for this to be a shock, but not that level of shock?
So let's see the strategic reserves release, assuming it were all going to go for the 20 million barrels per day that in principle were disrupted. That's like 20 days. But the IA says that we have really a disruption of 8.5 million barrels per day because of all the alternative routes and strategic. That means we have twice the number of days available. So I think that we have somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks at most before things get really difficult. I forgot to mention that the key difference is that this is the closure of Hormuz. The world has seen disruptions of this size before, but those disruptions were easier to accommodate because we didn't have the choke points or one of them closed, basically. And this is what makes it more difficult. So yes, I do think that maybe we're already on the fourth week. So 1 month more, 1 month more and a half, and then we start seeing more problems. That said, we're already seeing that it is really hurting in Asia. And that's already an indication of what this might be. Asia is really having a hard time.
And is that largely centered in jet fuels or more broadly?
More broadly, we've checked the news. There's now draconian policies in many countries to conserve or to ration energy. And it's going to be a very difficult time. I wonder if this will mean more pressure on Iran. My take was that Iran would be very careful about closing Hormuz because it would be affecting many other countries, not only the ones it is warring with, but what my take has been superseded, right? Iran has other calculations, but I think the pressure will increase.
No, and it has been interesting how Iran has attacked neighboring countries. Like they haven't tried to keep it confined to retaliation against the US and Israel. How does that make you think about how this could unfold? I understand none of us has a crystal ball, but I'm curious if there might be certain actions or milestones that you're keeping your radar attuned to help you understand how this might play out.
So short term, there is no market solution except high prices for the shortage that this war has been creating. Right? There's no solution. We have no way to increase output anywhere in the planet to compensate for those losses. Medium to long term, and that means for practical purposes, a lot of time for these new products to get in, maybe there will be a solution. So now the question is, who blinks first? Iran or the US and its allies? And it doesn't seem that nobody is ready to blink, right? Somebody has to be able to pull back, or they have to find some common grounding. Judging by the news is difficult to see that this is happening anytime soon.
Yeah, and you had mentioned how the only near-term solution is higher prices. And like we saw after Russia invaded Ukraine, when the price goes up, wealthier countries find a way to pay and the market balances on the backs of the less wealthy countries. You mentioned it becoming a very serious situation already in a number of Asian countries. How is it playing out in Latin America so far?
Same worries. The question is to what extent countries will have the fiscal space to sustain, for example, as in Mexico, the gasoline subsidies and diesel subsidies that have been so ingrained into the policy regime and the expectations of the people. So it's going to affect the budgets of many countries from that angle. Not all of them are oil producers. You made the reference to the Ukraine invasion. I'm thinking of many other instances in which they were really hurting. I remember that 20 years ago, when oil prices were increasing because of the China demand shock, the countries in Central America were even thinking of building a new refinery, finding all sorts of ways to see if they could ease the pain of higher oil prices. For a region that is struggling to find consistent policy, this is going to be also very difficult.
Yeah, and you brought up fuel subsidies, which I think for many of us in the United States or Europe, they wouldn't be accustomed to thinking about, but fuel subsidies play a large role in many countries around the world.
was focusing on the consumption side. But fuel subsidies in the U.S. from the production side are quite present, right? Sure, and there's all sorts of supports for the production of oil and gas in the U.S. But for the region, I mean, Mexico has maximum prices of oil, for example, right? I mean, for gasoline. So that means subsidization, and it is not in this environment.
And at some point, does that lead to non-price rationing? I also remember with the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit for the 1970s, there was also the only being allowed to go fuel up your car on odd or even days, depending on your license plate number. Do you see like we could potentially see rationing in a number of countries where there's a cap on the price or a subsidy?
Well, we're not seeing that in Latin America. We're seeing cap of prices in some countries. Rationing, we're already seeing it in Asia. I think it was in Thailand, in Malaysia, they were already talking about those measures in Bangladesh and the like. So it's far from optimal, and I wonder if it's even wise to use that type of policy. What we learned from the oil shocks and the U.S. experience is that those price controls and those measures only delay the solution. And so it's
Well, now I've been asking you about how the recent geopolitical events are affecting energy markets. I kind of wanted to turn it around and ask, to what extent are the changes in the energy landscape that are occurring, U.S. becoming very dominant on the oil and gas side, China installing a tremendous amount of renewables, all these things that are happening around the world, how is that reshaping the stage on which geopolitics plays out right now?
I think the U.S. was emboldened and has been emboldened in its foreign policy, given the oil and gas and conventional revolution. Thanks to that revolution, thanks to so much production from the U.S., we are not seeing even higher prices given this disruption. But the U.S. started finding options in foreign policy that it didn't have before. China, with its many investments on electricity and renewables, is crafting an energy system that will make it less vulnerable to these type of disruptions, let alone all that is doing with storage and the like. So what we've seen, this is already the basis of these two economic powers competing and now negotiating in very different ways. What I mean to say is through various means and in different theaters, their dominance and space in the world's economy.
And I'd love to kind of finish our conversation today on a topic that you may have spent time on when you were at the IEF, I don't know, but it's that area of convergence and competition between the energy transition and energy security. How do you see the relationship between that basic need for energy security and the desire for an energy transition to a lower carbon energy system? Is there a competition between the two, or is there an alignment, a convergence? And how does that work for Mexico as well?
The key variable for the energy transition has been and will be cheap energy storage, batteries, whether at a large scale or at the scale of a car or a mobile phone, whatever, right? That will change everything. That will mean a real challenge to the oil and gas industry as we know it. We are not there yet, although we have seen a very impressive reductions in costs. But the challenges involved are behind the rethinking of the energy transition. The rethinking started before the Texas freeze that we had when it was 2021, 2022, showed that the way the system was designed, in which you have electricity depending on natural gas, both affected. I mean, natural gas also depending on electricity because of the equipment that uses electricity, right? Both connected to the internet. So you have three networks that are dependent on each other, and all of them are vulnerable by extension to cold weather, and your storage is not working either for natural gas or for electricity. I think that was also a wake-up call for how to rethink the transition. The UK faced something similar, but a few months later in the same year, and then you had also the invasion in Ukraine. So it's not so easy, and it's not going to be so fast. It's still the case that natural gas or some form of fossil fuel has with the basic backup capacity for the energy transition. To insist on unless and until we have cheap storage, this is not going to change in a substantial way, which is not to say that we're not going to keep seeing large investments in renewable power. Solar is making such amazing strides around the planet, but it won't be enough. In an era of geopolitics, armies still run on fossil fuels. You don't move tanks and airplanes and drones just on electricity, so it's going to take a while.
Where do you see the largest area for collaboration on the energy transition moving forward between countries with very different energy security profiles, very different resource endowments? And I'm thinking maybe particularly of Latin America, which I don't hear brought into that conversation enough.
It's partly because Latin America has so much clean energy that is not discussed as much, but there are important investments. But let me focus on Mexico and the US. For a long time, there's been a discussion or an idea that there should be much more electricity trade between both countries, given that NIMBY issues in Mexico are less intense as they are in the US. There's less opposition to this type of projects. You have less authorities to deal with on the Mexican side for these projects. So you could have more solar farms in northern Mexico that export clean electricity to the south of the US. But oddly enough, this has been a slow process because you need the stars to align institutionally and policy-wise for both countries to move in that direction. I think it's going to happen more and more, but it requires that type of alignment.
And over the last, say, 10 years, if you think back to some of your IEF days, how has people's attitude towards the energy transition changed or evolved, do you think?
I think it depends a lot on the industry participant you're talking with, right? People that have their feet deep into oil and gas, they think that the transition is a lot of hot air, that it is happening, but not as soon as it is being said, and that oil and gas will be there forever to support the industry. And people that are developing the technologies for renewables or that are dependent on renewables say that this is possible and that will happen very soon. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The case is that countries or regions that have gone very aggressively toward renewables, and I'm thinking of Europe, found themselves, yes, with greater flexibility, but higher energy costs, and not necessarily the reliability that they were expecting. And that has been also a lesson that the energy transition is not cheap. We learned from Germany and Spain that it also requires fiscal space that isn't always available. And that hasn't changed much, even though these technologies have become cheaper, technologies for solar generation, notably.
And one last question before I let you go. Really appreciate your time with us today. Just curious, as you're thinking about your work at Rice and Latin America Energy Studies, what are some of the topics that are going to be most engaging to you?
Wow. There's so many topics around. But if we think of Latin America, what happens in Venezuela is going to be very interesting. The extent to which Argentina becomes a real new player in the world industry will be also something to be looking at. Suriname, whether it joins Guyana in becoming an important producer. Mexico is always a little bit of a wild card, but it's also a country with so much potential. the Mexican side of the Eagle Ford geological formation that has been such a successful natural gas producer extends into Mexico. And the Mexican side, in principle, is larger than the U.S. side. That's an area to be looking at if, again, conditions will be materializing. Of course, how Brazil is contributing to increasing production in the world is also something to be looking at. And in general, the processes of integration, whether they indeed happen or not. Now it's an even open question now that we're moving into a world of regions. It's funny, in the 90s, we were talking about regionalization. Then the century began and we talked more about globalization. And now we're back to the regionalization story, our world of regions.
Well, I'll look forward to catching up with you on all those in the future. Thanks so much for sitting down with us today here in the Nexus Ballroom. Really appreciate it. Great talking with you, Aldo.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. It has been fun.
Thanks again to Aldo Flores-Quiroga, non-resident fellow for Latin America Energy Studies at the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with more conversations recorded here at S&P Global CERAWeek, brought to you in a special episode of Smarter Markets Presents, Scenes from CERAWeek 2026, Convergence and Competition, Energy, Technology, and Geopolitics. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter Markets are here. Contact sales at abax.exchange to get started. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.